Everybody, and welcome to Coffee with a Therapist this wonderful Monday morning. I just wanted to say your feedback on topics you wanted covered was awesome. I am hearing you, and I thought it was really interesting to kind of take inventory of those top 3 topics. So the top 3 topics that I received feedback on were, first, all things boundaries. Second, toxic parenting relationships mostly, and also other relationships or like breakups, how to deal with a toxic or healing after a toxic relationship breakup. And the last was subconscious trauma. So how we figure out and connect the dots between trauma that maybe we have no memory of, or we haven't connected the dots to, or even really defining what trauma is so that people can connect the dots. Because often what I've seen in therapy is that people have a very misguided definition of what trauma is, and that's why they think they've not had any trauma in their lives. And I'm just going to be very front or forward that we have all had trauma. Nobody in this life is unscathed. But there's a difference between big T and little t trauma. But if you are human and existing in this imperfect world, then you have had trauma. And so it's not anything to be ashamed about. It's nothing to, hide from. And it's a good thing for us to connect those dots so that we can heal from it and live our lives in accordance to our core values. I'm very excited to talk about boundaries. What I found interesting with some of my clients is either A, they believe that they don't do boundaries well at all, and they kind of recognize that and feel very aimless and struggle with people pleasing and know that they really struggle with boundaries. Or B, some of my clients come in and they think that they're really good at boundaries. And inevitably, at some point, we figure out they really struggle with boundaries, whether it's, actually setting them in an effective way, or they may be really good at boundaries in one area and really struggle in another. So I would encourage you that even if you think that you're like real good at boundaries, that still definitely hang in with me with this series, because as I've taken my clients through the different components and elements of boundaries, they found that there were many pieces that they were missing or they didn't recognize or understand, and they weren't implementing in their lives. And so it was really interesting because they were starting to maybe understand why certain relationships weren't working out the way that they wanted to, or why they were feeling resentment or anger. Or one of the biggest things I see is that when we struggle with boundaries, we ultimately will have a not so great relationship with ourselves, and we can really struggle with our self-esteem, our self-respect. And so learning how to set good boundaries with ourselves and others really builds our self-esteem and our self-confidence. So if you struggle with confidence at all or self-esteem, definitely pay attention to the next couple of weeks as we go through all these different elements, because this is for you. And this is one of the best ways we can build our self-respect and confidence. The other thing too is I want to emphasize that boundaries are kind. They are loving to set boundaries. I think often they get a bad rep of just being too bossy or assertive or conflictual or hurtful, but really boundaries are super kind, and they ultimately benefit ourselves and other people and the relationships we have with them. So I am so excited to be talking about boundaries. Today we're just going to delve into the general overview of what a boundary is. And there's 5 different components that I want to talk about. Number 1, a boundary is simply a guideline, a rule, or a limit. It's just something that states, this is what I'm okay with, and this is what I'm not okay with. And part of figuring out our boundaries means that we actually have to ask ourselves the questions and pay attention to when we do get upset and we start to recognize, okay, this is something that I'm not okay with. And sometimes people don't trust that voice. They think, oh, well, I should just get over it, or I just want to be easygoing. And so I would encourage you, if there's something that continuously bothers you and comes up over time, that it is super important that you take inventory of that and honor it, because it's likely a boundary that you have to set with yourself, with another person, or with your schedule. So definitely pay attention to those, even those little things that bother you. Number 2, a really important component of boundaries is that we identify them for ourselves. So nobody gets to tell us our boundaries. They're internal. They come from us. And they really define how we feel safe being treated by others. So I remember learning about the golden rule, and it was always like, treat people how you want to be treated. And boundaries, actually, if you're really good with boundaries, you learn that it's actually about treating people how they want to be treated, because we all have different things that we like in life. We all have different things that make us feel safe. There are things that I do with some clients that I don't do with others, not because I'm being inauthentic, but because we have different boundaries and nuances about what makes them feel safe with that thing, right? Because we are all different, we're all unique, we're all going to absorb things in different ways. And so boundaries aren't about what we think other people will feel safe with. It's ultimately what they feel safe with, and they get to define them and they get to set them. So this isn't about you following some societal rules or creating boundaries that other people have. There are going to be things that you're totally okay with that other people are not, and that's absolutely okay. The only thing you have to do is honor yourself in that. That's it. Just honor yourself, listen to that voice, and understand that it's okay if your boundaries are unique, or if you're okay with something that maybe someone else isn't okay with. You've ultimately got to decide from yourself what feels safe, and if that's coming from your core values. The third component I want to talk about is they provide protection for us so we can be vulnerable. So when we have good boundaries, we are actually able to be more vulnerable, more ourselves in relationships, and we get to really be honest about who we are and what we're okay with. So one of the biggest annoyances for my people pleasers is when I tell them that they really struggle with authenticity. Because in their minds, they like to see themselves as authentic. They like to think that like they're just this really kind, easygoing person. But in actuality, in many of their relationships, they are not letting the other person see who they really are. And they really struggle to tell people when things are not okay, or when there's conflict, or when something else is just bothering them. And so in effect, working on boundaries for them is inevitably learning how to be more of themselves, and learning that it's okay if you have disagreements, or to quote unquote rock the boat, to express yourself in a healthy way, right? We were not made to just be easygoing and go with the flow with everything, because if we do that, we lose ourselves. And that's again where we might lose our self-respect and our self-esteem over time in a relationship. And for our partners, it sucks for them because they don't actually know who we are either. And there have been things that have come out in therapy and couple sessions where the couple or the other partner looks at them and they're like, why didn't you tell me that bothered you? Right? Because it's almost hurtful for them too, because they're like, why didn't you trust me enough to know that like I'm going to love you and you belong even when we disagree, or even when I do things that are annoying and bother you, right? And so inevitably setting boundaries also means that we're starting to get honest, and they protect us in a way so that we can be vulnerable in relationships and really have more depth and be seen in relationships. So they create more closeness in our relationships. And I think we all definitely desire that, especially with a close few people that, we love and care about. The fourth thing that's really important is that if we have boundaries that are violated, it's really important that we have an equitable consequence to it. So there's this phrase, and I love it. It's a boundary without a consequence is simply a threat, right? And so often what clients have done when they're first doing boundaries, they'll set them, but then there's no consequence. And they're like, why is no one following my boundaries? And I'm like, well, you've got to have like an equitable consequence, right? We don't want the crime to be the punishment to be too severe. We also don't want it to be so lackluster that nobody cares about it, but there needs to be an equitable consequence to that thing. And to really get into the nitty-gritty of that, I would recommend working with a therapist, because there's so many different ways you can create what we call equitable consequences. But that's definitely something to consider if you feel like people don't respect or listen to your boundaries. Are you having equitable consequences? And then the last thing is that they define where we end and where others begin. Boundaries, like I said before, they're so important because they help us know who we are, and they help us define the safety net for our relationships so that we can be intimate with other people, we can be vulnerable, and they help other people feel vulnerable and safe with us as well. Boundaries are purely relational, and they help us have healthier relationships with other people. If you have any specific questions about these 5 different components, I'm absolutely happy to answer them. I will be going through all sorts of different things in the next couple of weeks, all about boundaries. So if you have specific questions, let me know, and I will make sure I address them in these videos. All right, y'all, I hope you have a wonderful Monday. Do some belly breathing, and I will catch up with you tomorrow. Take care.